My name's Professor David Smith. I'm Director of the Coral Reef Research Unit at the University of Essex. I'm here in Curious Marine National Park leading an expedition in collaboration with the Seychelles National Parks Authority to investigate the health and biodiversity of coral reefs at the park. This project is in collaboration with the Earthwatch Institute and the Mitsubishi Corporation and has been going on since 2006. In the early days, the expedition moved around from island to island, but since 2008, we've been focused working both in the laboratory, which is a homemade laboratory, and in the field here at Curious. Coral reefs are some of the most important systems on the planet. There are more species on a coral reef than anywhere else in the world's oceans. They're a reservoir of biodiversity and extremely important, not only for global biodiversity, but also because they support the livelihoods, that's food and income, for about a tenth of the world's population. So you can imagine the scenario is if we start to lose coral reefs and the food that they provide, there could be some real problems for society ahead. Unfortunately, despite their importance, it's well known that coral reefs around the world are threatened by multiple sources. On average, coral reefs per decade might lose 10% of their cover. And this could be catastrophic for not only global biodiversity, but again for the many millions of people who depend on them. Corals are simply the architects of the world's oceans. Corals are an animal that live in a symbiotic relationship with a small microscopic algae. And that algae photosynthesizes and provides the coral with its food that it needs to grow. The byproduct of that relationship is the secretion of calcium carbonate, or limestone. And it's that skeleton, that limestone skeleton, that provides all the beautiful complex structures that you see if you're lucky enough to swim over a coral reef. That 3D structure provides a habitat for all the different species and all, of course, the food species that we depend on. If that relationship breaks down, the relationship between the animal and the symbiotic algae, then corals can die fairly rapidly. So there are many threats to coral reefs: overexploitation, physical destruction during land development, pollution from land or from sea, many different factors that cause their demise. Some scientists will actually predict that in the next 50 years, coral reefs will be lost from our planet altogether. So that's in the next generation. This could be absolutely catastrophic. One of the biggest threats that we now know facing coral reefs is the threat of climate change. In 1998, there was a global phenomena called the El Nino, which really demonstrated how vulnerable coral reefs are to rapid, acute changes in climate. In 1998, the biggest El Nino in recorded history caused temperatures of the sea in this region to go up by 1, 2, sometimes 3 degrees for a couple of months. That was enough to kill up to 90% of the corals in this region. 16% of corals worldwide were killed just during that one event. If you extrapolate that into the future, then we could really face problems. Okay? So, one of the questions our research has been asking is, during that 98 event, what corals survived, what are tolerant? In other words, what are able to survive these climatic events and possibly climate change in the future, and what corals are most vulnerable? And importantly, how are those different corals, how important they are in supporting global biodiversity and food productivity, and of course food security. What we found is when we surveyed reefs of this incredibly rich marine park, then it was clear that some corals were of an age much more than 10 years and therefore must have survived the 98 event. Other corals were completely absent from the system and we assume were killed in 98. That's all by association. Of course, to really get to the answer, we need to carry out detailed laboratory experiments. And in collaboration with our colleagues here at SNPA, we have carried out laboratory experiments which have put corals that we think are vulnerable and also tolerant through these rapid climate changes by increasing the temperature. And the laboratory experiments actually supported the field investigations perfectly. There were corals which are tolerant and vulnerable. Unfortunately, these vulnerable corals are also the corals that are most complex. So we still now know what the problem is, but what do we do about it? That was our second question. What can we do? How can we, if at all, increase the tolerance of the most vulnerable species. So we look to extreme environments. The environment behind me, Bay La Rae in Curious Marine National Park, is a mangrove system, which we know the waters get to very high temperatures because it's very shallow. And we looked to this system to see if there were any corals of that vulnerable type that were surviving. And a bit of a eureka moment demonstrated that yes, there are some corals which seem to be vulnerable in the open ocean, but here in these unique systems seem to be tolerant to some of these thermal events. We ask the question again, why? Is there some way in which we can grow corals in such habitats to increase their tolerance to some of these events? And that's where we are at the moment. Managing climate change, managing the implications of climate change is of key importance to us. The final part of our experimentation was dealing with the other carbon problem associated with climate change. That's not elevated temperatures, but that's the acidification of the world's oceans. As CO2 goes up into the atmosphere, it absorbs into water and it reduces the pH and the ability of corals to secrete their big carbonate limestone skeletons. And again, we ask the question, what corals are most tolerant and what are most vulnerable? For this, like in the previous experiments, we demonstrated there was a big difference between different species. But we also wanted to find a natural habitat which naturally had low pH. Open ocean signals about 8.1. In 200 years' time, we expect ocean pH to be around about 7.8. So are there any natural systems on Earth today that mimic these 7.8s of the future? And lo and behold, again, the bay that we have behind us, Bay La Rae, because it's a mangrove system, there's lots of nutrients in the water, lots of bacteria breaking down those nutrients, dragging the oxygen out, putting more CO2 naturally into the system. That system experiences a pH today that we'd expect for the future on open ocean systems. And again, we've demonstrated that there are actually corals living in that unique bay region that are able to survive in conditions that we predict for the future. The question is, how do they survive? And what does survival really mean? Can they grow? Can they support biodiversity? And that's where we are at the moment. So our research, which has been going on now for 8 years, is a unique collaboration between the Parks Authority, between an international NGO, Earthwatch, through a British university. We have volunteers from the Seychelles University, and of course we're sponsored by an international corporate, the Mitsubishi Corporation. And it's a unique set of studies to really push research further and not just ask what are the likely outcomes of climate change, but what can we do about it. We all need to play our part by reducing carbon emissions and living more sustainably, but what can we do to protect natural systems from some of these predicted events in the future?
I'm Dr. David Suggett. I head up the Coral Physiology Processes Group at the University of Technology, Sydney. And one of my roles here in Curious Marine National Park as part of the research team is to really understand how corals can push their physiological limits to survive under extreme environments. We now know from diving the reefs around Curious Marine National Park and also into the mangroves here is that we now find many corals in environments we'd never thought we'd find them before. In particular, the murky waters of the mangroves that you see in the background here, we find many species that we typically think are very sensitive to environmental change and climate change. By living in these mangrove environments, they've actually armed themselves with some very important weaponry in terms of facing the future. The mangrove waters here are very warm, and the pH drops incredibly low every day as a result of all the organic matter that flows out through the forests. And what this means is that every day the corals are subjected to exceptionally warm waters and exceptionally acidic waters relative to on the main reef. And these conditions are actually the same conditions that are predicted in about 50 years' time as a result of climate change from all the carbon dioxide we're pushing into our oceans and atmosphere. So by looking at these in situ observations, we now know that these corals are able to thrive under conditions that could be representative of the future. What we really want to know, not just that they can do it, but how they can do it. And for that, we need to move into the laboratory. So on Curios, we've established a coral physiology lab here where we can look at the metabolism of the corals. Now, why that's so important is we can actually examine the physiological trade-offs a coral is prepared to make. A coral can live in these extreme environments, but it has to do that at a cost. And the way it seems to be able to do this is it shoves all its energy into regulating its internal pH. What this means is that it has less energy available to grow and probably to reproduce. But the benefit, of course, is it can mean it can start to expand and explore a niche that otherwise is unoccupied by corals. So it's an exceptionally clever strategy to really ensure that corals have the maximum environmental spread. By looking at what we call the coral holobionts, this is particularly the coral animal, its algal symbiont, and all of the bacteria that live in association. So the coral is what we call an organism of many, many animals. And we analyse each of those components individually. So we look at how much the algae can photosynthesize, we look at how much the coral can calcify, and we look at how much respiration the bacteria undergo. And by disentangling all of these intricate parts of the coral holobiont, we can start to understand the various roles that these components play. Our next step is to understand the genetics. It's all very well that we can understand the physiology, but what we really need to know as the next step is to understand whether the corals we see in the mangroves here in the extreme environments are the same population that exist in the reef, but they've able to physiologically evolve, or whether they're truly genetically adapted organisms that over generations and generations have evolved and adapted to thrive in these environments. We've taken the first step. The first step in this is really looking at the type of algae the corals have. This is very important because on the main reef, we see many of the corals have the same sort of algae in terms of its genetic structure and consequently what we would call a species. However, as you move into these mangrove environments, they seem to have selected for an algae that has much more tolerance, in particular to temperature. The second aspect we're starting to understand is that the corals we see in these environments certainly have the ability to upregulate their pH internal metabolism. Now, whether that's a genetic signature or not is still yet to be answered, and that's the next stage of our quest here in Curios Marine National Park, is to really understand who lives where and why. And it's only through that information can we begin to inform management, and working with our partners here, the Seychelles National Parks Authority, can we begin to really provide the information as to what environments need to be managed and to what extent.
One of the obvious questions that we might get asked is why would we want to choose this area for our research? And of course the second part of our research, as well as looking at the implications of climate change, is asking a straightforward question: how successful is current day management practices in conserving reef systems? We're very lucky in our job that we travel around many different regions around the world, all the way from Indonesia and Australia through to the Caribbean, and we've looked at different reef systems. And I'm really happy to say that Curios Marine Park is one of the only areas that we've visited, at least, where the coral cover that we see is increasing year on year. Not across all sites, of course, but on average there's an increase in coral, which means there's an increase in the complexity of the system, which means it can support more fish. The management of the park is a no-take management scheme. No fisheries activity at all. There may be some digression, but the vast majority of fisheries does not exist. That allows us to really ask some very specific questions about some of these other impacts, such as the El Ninos and potential impacts of climate change, because other human activities are being massively decreased. The park is working. It's extremely important for the Seychelles. Not only does it have these unique systems, which are banks of genetic biodiversity with these super tolerant species, that if there's a future El Nino or through climate change issues, there are changes to seawater chemistry and temperatures, that these corals might be able to restock other reefs around the region. They're incredibly important for local biodiversity for now and for the future. The issues of marine parks have been well studied. Without no-take areas and strict protection, they simply don't work. But of course, what we have here is a bank, again, of not only corals, but the fish that depend on those corals for a habitat. And those fish increase in number, increase in size, the biomass will increase. We can see that from our data. We carry out something like 60 Transect surveys every year, and we see increases every year. That biomass will spill over into adjacent areas. You protect this area, it has benefits for much larger areas. So I'd ask people to support marine protected areas. This is a place of outstanding natural beauty. It's a place which is globally important for biodiversity and locally important for food production. Without marine protection, without strict management, then simply we will not have these systems in the future. And it's imperative for the welfare of society, and again, a tenth of the world's populations, that we protect these very special places, both now and into the future, and we find solutions to some of the problems that we face very, very shortly.